Well, good afternoon, everyone. The last class of this week. I still have to do a makeup. I don't know when I'm going to do it, probably next week sometime. This class is about Sir Arthur Evans at the palace site of Knossos on the island of Crete, the realm of the Minotaur. Well, as we saw in the last class, Schliemann, working at Mycenae and at Tiryns, had found a particularly distinctive type of pottery there at both sites. We call it late Helladic ware now, he called it Mycenaean ware. The distinctive feature being these spiral decorations, painted decorations on these vases, as we see there and there. So a very distinctive pottery. And when Schliemann began to do more research on this type of pottery, he found out that it was discovered all over Greece. It had also been found on the west coast of Turkey, in the Aegean Islands, on Crete, North Africa, Cyrene, in Egypt, and in Syria as well. What this did was to convince Schliemann, bearing in mind what he'd found at Mycenae and Tiryns, evidence of societies that had large trade contacts, he then became convinced that he had the evidence for a Bronze Age civilization that had, in effect, controlled the whole of the Mediterranean world. And the most logical place for this to be centered on was Crete, in the center of the distribution of the pottery. Schliemann, remember, had a very good knowledge of ancient Greek tradition and myth and legend, and he was well aware of the legend related to the island of Crete, the legend of King Minos. The legend says that King Minos, a ruler who lived somewhere in Crete at a palace called Knossos, had underneath the palace a series of underground chambers known as the labyrinth. Labyrinth because they twisted from one area to another. And in the labyrinth, according to the legend, King Minos kept the Minotaur. Taurus bull, so this is Minos's bull. But this creature was half human and half bull. Now, according to the legend, King Minos sent his son Androgynous to Athens to take part in the religious games there. But he was so successful that the king of Athens decided to kill him to stop him from winning any more of the competitions. So what Minos does is he responds to this by invading Athens. He captures the city, he burns the city to the ground. Aegeus, the king of Athens at this time, pleads for peace, and what Minos says is you can have peace on one condition, and that is that every 9 years, starting from that year, the Athenians would have to send to him 7 youths and 7 young girls to Crete, where there would be a human sacrifice for the Minotaur. So it was that for every 9 years, for a while afterwards, 14 young Athenians were sent to Minos. But the third time this was due to happen, the people of Athens said to Aegeus, you've got to do something about this. Well, Aegeus' son was called Theseus, and he was a great hero of this particular period. He did lots of wonderful things throughout the world. He just got back to Athens and he volunteered to solve the problem by killing the Minotaur. And so he sailed with the next group of Athenians to Crete. When they arrived at Crete, they were placed in a locked room. And while they were standing in the locked room, Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, saw Theseus and fell hopelessly in love with him. She determined to rescue him. So when the time actually came for the sacrifice, Theseus chose to be the first person who would go to the Minotaur, and Ariadne managed to give him secretly a sword with which he could kill the Minotaur and hopefully come out and take her away and marry her and live happily ever after. But she knew that a labyrinth, underground, very dark, lots of twisting corridors and passages, it would be very difficult for Theseus to find his way out. So she gave him a ball of wool. She held one end of this. He walked into the labyrinth with the other end of the ball of wool, found the Minotaur, killed the Minotaur, and came back along the ball of wool. Ariadne is the goddess of spinning and sewing, by the way, making clothes. So he was able to get out, and they managed to get down to the ship. And they boarded a ship and they set to sail for Athens. But no Greek legend is complete without a tragedy. There's several tragedies in this story, but a particular tragedy is this. Theseus had forgotten that he promised to sail back to Athens in the same ship with white sails to show that he had killed the Minotaur. But the ship had black sails on it, and he forgot to take them down as he approached Athens. So when they arrived outside Athens, Aegeus was standing on a cliff looking for the ship. There is no cliff at the harbour of Athens, I can tell you that now, but that's beside the point. He saw the ship coming up with black sails. He decided that Theseus must have died trying to kill the Minotaur. So he jumps off the cliff and dies. And that's why what Turkish people call the Akdeniz, we call the Aegean Sea after Aegeus. One version of the legend then goes on to say that Theseus then returned to Knossos to destroy the palace, to burn it to the ground, revenge for the death of his father. Well, this particular legend is one of the oldest and most popular legends in Greek art. We find the story of Theseus and the Minotaur on the earliest of Greek painted pottery. We find it in the latest of Greek sculpture as well. We don't know if Schliemann believed that the legend was true, but we do know that using Pausanias as his guide, he decided that he would go to Crete and find the site of the palace of Knossos. Remember, Schliemann had a great belief in the absolute truth of all the old stories. Pausanias he trusted impeccably. He'd found Mycenae thanks to Pausanias. So he made his way to Crete, and with a copy of Pausanias in one hand, he lands at Heraklion, the capital, walks inland to find a site which fits the description of Knossos as given by Pausanias. And as I mentioned in the last class, he found a site covered with Mycenaean-type pottery. But while the Greek villagers were willing to sell their part of the site, an olive grove, the Turkish villagers were not. And so Schliemann left Crete, never to return, although he always said that it was the one site he really did want to excavate at the end of his life. And so it was left to an Englishman, Sir Arthur Evans, to become the person who revealed the secrets of Knossos. Arthur Evans was the son of John Evans. John Evans, a wealthy owner of a paper factory. John Evans, the same John Evans as the John Evans who went to see Boucher de Perth and found the stone tools at Abbeville and helped prove to the world in 1859 that sure enough Boucher de Perth had been finding stone tools with the bones of extinct animals. Well, obviously being the son of a famous geologist, Arthur Evans started studying geology at an early age. By the time he was 7, he was collecting ancient Greek and Roman coins and going with John Evans on geological expeditions. He went to Oxford University. By that time, he'd become fascinated with politics. Now, we're talking about the period 1870, 1880, when the politics of the Balkan region were particularly complicated. Greece had only recently become independent. The Ottoman Empire still had large parts of the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had large parts of the Balkans. Arthur Evans became fascinated by the politics of the Balkans, so that when he actually graduated from Oxford in 1875, he decided to become a journalist specialising in reports on the political situation in the Balkans. The paper he worked for was the Manchester Guardian, my favourite paper today, except it's now called just the Guardian. It seemed that he was also acting as a spy on behalf of the British government. A common disguise that spies use is to be a journalist or to be an archaeologist, because that explains why you go to all sorts of strange places that people don't normally go to. Anyway, he was captured by the Austro-Hungarian authorities and sent to prison for 6 weeks. In 1882, he was eventually released and made his way back to Oxford, where he had to find a job. Well, political and social contacts do everything in the world then and today. And thanks to his family, he managed to become the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. This is the oldest museum, public museum in the world, founded in 1671. And at this time, the job of the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum was really just to socialize, to go to lunches and dinners and get more money and more things for the museum. But what Arthur Evans decided to do was actually build up the museum collections, make it a proper museum. So in the next 5 years, he created an entirely new set of displays, and he acquired for the museum 2,000 new objects. He also argued for the construction of a new Ashmolean Museum, which is the one you see in Oxford today. This was approved in 1893. Much of the material that Arthur Evans collected for the Ashmolean as keeper consisted of objects from the Bronze Age, from Greece, and from the Aegean Islands. He had heard Schliemann give a lecture in London in 1883. He had seen the objects that Schliemann brought with him for display. This seems to have started his interest in the Bronze Age Aegean world. At first, he started to collect objects from London antique shops, things like beautiful gold seal rings like this. A seal mürdür, I think in Turkish, for making an impression on wax on a piece of paper. Then he started to go to Greece, to the Aegean Islands and the Balkans, and he gradually built up quite a significant collection of these seal rings. Well, he could see that some of the seal rings had designs on them that were very similar to the paintings that Schliemann had found in the palace at Tiryns. But while he was collecting these seal rings, he also started collecting clay tablets from Greece, from the Aegean world, and one or two from the Balkans as well. He started to look at these and saw that they were covered with symbols, which he thought was quite possibly an early form of writing. He then discovered that pieces of Mycenaean-type pottery had been found at Mycenae and Tiryns with the same type of symbols on them, and also pieces of Mycenaean pottery had been found in Egypt with the same type of symbols. So he became convinced that this must be some form of early Bronze Age or late Bronze Age writing. Well, Evans soon learned that most of these seals and the majority of the clay tablets that he was able to collect had been found on Crete. And so in 1894, he made his first visit to the island, and in the antique market at Heraklion, he soon found another 22 seals and more clay tablets of the same type. He then discovered at Heraklion that most of these objects had come from the village of Kefala, the same village that Schliemann had gone to, which Schliemann had become convinced was the site of Knossos. But when Evans went there, he found Mycenaean pottery, just like Schliemann. Like Schliemann, he concluded that this must be the palace of Bronze Age date. We don't know if he thought it was the palace of Minos or not, but certainly a palace of Bronze Age date. So he bought part of the land. Now remember from the last class that some of the Greek villagers had agreed a price with Schliemann, but when the Turkish villagers refused to play ball and pay up, Schliemann left the island. Well, the Greek villagers who still own part of the area were happy to sell it for the same amount of money to Evans. The Turkish villagers once again refused to do so. They wanted an extra large price. So Evans appointed a lawyer to look after the land purchase for him while he travelled around Crete. In the rest of that year, he found more and more clay tablets in antique shops in different places. He found women wearing seals of the same type of thing. And then he went back to Oxford. He didn't have a job after all. And he decided to sit down and analyse all this material. Within 1 year, he was able to publish a book called Cretan Pictographs and Pre-Phoenician Script. A word of explanation. By the late 19th century, it was recognized that the earliest form of alphabet that we have was developed in Phoenicia, which is roughly modern Lebanon, and that the Greeks in Miletus, on the south coast of what is now Turkey, had taken the idea from Miletus and then it had spread to Greece. So pre-Phoenician means a type of writing from before the alphabet used by the Greeks. Well, looking at this material, he found he had 3 different types of script. One he called Cretan pictographs. There seemed to be a group of symbols, but some he could recognize. This looks like a vase or something like that. He came to the conclusion after studying this that this was probably something rather like hieroglyphics, a series of pictographs that conveyed ideas, but not necessarily much more than that. Cretan pictographs, tablets with Cretan pictographs, were only found on the island of Crete. So to Evans, this implied that this was the earliest form of writing in the Mediterranean world, the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. He then looked at the other tablets and found that he had 2 different types of script, which he recognized was probably an alphabet. Now, how you do this is you count the number of symbols. Most alphabets have got between roughly 26 and 35, 40 different symbols. He had less than 40 different symbols, so this implied it was an alphabet of some kind, but an alphabet that did in some cases use pictographs, which were obviously copied from the earlier pictographs writing. Looking at these tablets, he could see he had 2 different types of script. One he called Linear A, because it is made up of straight lines. The other is Linear B, again made up of straight lines. Linear A tablets were only found on Crete. Linear B tablets were found at Mycenae, Tiryns, and on Crete. So logically, Linear B, that's why it's Linear B, had to be the latest of these languages. While Evans was working on his book, publishing his book, his lawyer on Crete was working on trying to get the land owned by the Turkish villagers. And he managed to find an old law on the island that basically meant that nobody could sell land for more than the official price. And so the Turkish villagers were basically forced to sell their land to Arthur Evans. In a sense, they might have been motivated by the fact that there had already been riots between the Greek Christian population and the Turkish Muslim population on the island. These riots developed in such a way that in 1896, a war began on Crete. The Greco-Turkish War of 1897 began the next year, ended in 1898, with the Ottoman Empire surrendering the island of Crete to the Kingdom of Greece. The majority population was Greek Christian. So now Evans had to get a permit, which he got from the Greek government, to begin work at Knossos. He'd been on several geological expeditions and excavations with his father. He had very little archaeological experience, but he was aware, he did know of the methods of excavation using the law of superposition, which the Germans were using at Olympia at the same time. And so he decided right from the start to make a point of examining every different layer of soil that was uncovered, recording every single find in every layer of soil. At the end of each day, checking his notes documenting basically everything that he'd found on the site. What this meant was that within a few days of starting work at Knossos, he was able to actually give some sense of history to the site. He could see that there was a very early occupation level. Then there had been a series of very large buildings. These had been destroyed by a fire. And then there had been a second series of buildings constructed over that. The first major period of buildings, the layers of soil produced clay tablets with Linear A writing on them, and also a very few Cretan pictograph tablets. The second period of occupation produced tablets with Linear B writing on them, so that confirmed what he had already suspected. But the most important thing, though, was his careful use of the law of superposition gave him the opportunity to give an approximate date to what he was excavating. For example, in layers associated with the earliest palace, he found what we call an alabastron, the lid of an alabastron. This particular type of alabastron was a type of alabastron which was made in Egypt and which could be dated from examples with hieroglyphs on them to the 17th or the 16th century BC. So he had an approximate date for his first main period of occupation on Knossos. The second period of construction at the site produced pieces of pottery, Mycenaean type pottery, or really Minoan type pottery as we call it now. Examples of exactly the same type of pottery had been found at a site I'll be talking about in another class at Amarna. The site of Amarna in Egypt was only occupied for a period of about 10 or 11 years around 1350 BC. So the law of superposition, careful recording, gave him this really vital evidence for actually dating the occupation levels at the site. Well, Evans now began to clear the entire site of Knossos. It's slightly less than 1 hectare. And by the end of 1900, he'd already discovered that essentially it consisted of a large central courtyard with over 1,000 rooms around that courtyard, some at ground level, some cut into the ground level as well. This is an aerial view. This is the basic plan which I'll be using throughout to explain the site. What he discovered was that on the southwest corner of the site there was evidence of an ornamental entrance, but also a series of storerooms or magazines all along the west side of the main part of the site. All of these storerooms, workshops and magazines contained large jars like this. He could see from looking at the surviving evidence that some of these had been used to store wheat and barley and things like that, but the most of them have probably been used for storing olive oil. And when he looked at the number of jars he had and calculated the capacity of the jars, he realized he had enough jars to store 395,000 litres of olive oil. We call these jars, by the way, pithos singular, pithoi plural. And this photograph from the time of the excavations gives you an idea of just how big they can be. I think I mentioned before that when I was growing up and I heard the story of Ali Baba and the 40 thieves, and I couldn't understand how the 40 thieves could hide inside pottery jars. Nothing in England was bigger than that. But when you see a pottery jar like this, you can see how somebody can hide themselves inside that. Next to these storerooms were a group of rooms, and he could see the remains of a stairway, a group of rooms that must have existed on at least 2 floor levels. Remnants of painted plaster indicated that these were very elaborately decorated. But in one of the rooms, he found, still in place, a chair made of alabaster, a type of rock, in a room surrounded by stone benches. Well, it looks like a throne for a king or a ruler. He assumed it was probably a throne for a king or a ruler. And when he looked at all the painted plaster, which had fallen off the wall, of course, it's now been restored, he could see that the room was decorated with griffins. Well, a griffin is a mythical beast that comes really from the Orient. It features a lot in Mesopotamian mythology. But the griffin and the lion were always the most commonly accepted symbols of a king or a ruler in the Bronze Age and even later periods. So having found this chair that looked like a throne, having found the griffin frescoes, Evans was convinced that he had actually found the throne room, the official state rooms of the king of Knossos. On the north side of the courtyard, another series of small workshops and things like that. Also, the remains of a very large hall. The roof had been supported by wooden columns. He realized that this was probably some kind of assembly hall. On the south side of the enclosure, evidence of a very elaborate entranceway to go in there. It's on the east side, though, that he found in many ways what he thought was the most remarkable discovery. The east side is actually built into the side of a hill. It's terraced. So the site at Knossos, where the courtyard is pretty flat. The east side goes like that. And what he found was a series of 4 floor layers, if you like, of rooms going down into the side of the hill there. These were entered by what he called the grand staircase. An elaborate staircase with the remnants of wooden columns around it that went down through all the levels within the site. And this is how it looks today after having been reconstructed. One group of rooms seemed to be more important than the rest. One very large room with a roof supported by stone columns and a smaller room to one side. He decided that these were probably for the king and the queen of Knossos. Both rooms were elaborately decorated, had floors of shining white limestone to reflect the light coming up out from the grand staircase and from whatever windows there were. Both rooms were decorated with painted wall plaster, and they were elaborately provided with things like private bathrooms. Nice little hip bath there of Bronze Age date. And again, you see the spiral ornaments, so characteristic of Bronze Age period decoration. There's even a toilet connected to a remarkable series of drains that ran from the top of the courtyard. They brought running water down into the toilet. So you had flush toilets, basically, in this Bronze Age building. What was perhaps more surprising in many ways when Evans started looking around at what he found here was close examination of the stone pillars revealed that they'd been decorated with what looks like a double triangle. Well, this is a representation of a type of war axe, a battle axe, which is known as a labris. The labris was a type of weapon that was used throughout Bronze Age Crete. Evans found actual examples of them made of bronze. This is the top of a real one on a modern wooden stand. We find the labris on pottery as well. It clearly served as a form of good luck charm because you also find small gold pendants about 4 centimeters high in the shape of a labris. But the most remarkable feature of these particular rooms, but also of other rooms around the throne room, was that many of the walls had clearly been decorated with frescoes. Now, a fresco is a method of painting in which you apply white plaster to a wall, and while the plaster is still wet, you paint the design into the plaster, so it becomes fixed with the plaster. It's very different from secco wall painting, which is when you allow the plaster to dry and then you paint over it. The most significant thing about these frescoes was they'd all fallen from the walls, they all had to be reconstructed, was the variety of images you see in them. A lot of them are connected with marine life, so you've got this beautiful fresco in one room of these dolphins and other types of fish and seashells at the bottom. And again, this spiral decoration, so characteristic of the Bronze Age. In one room, you even have an octopus showing. But the majority of the frescoes showed scenes from everyday life, or what could be interpreted as everyday life. So, for example, there was this fresco, which clearly shows a building with columns at the front, a lower level there. It's been reconstructed, as you can see, significantly, but you can just see the remains of paintings of figures, and down here are the figures of people outside this building. Well, Evans remembered, of course, the fact that on the other side of the courtyard, the throne room was on 2 levels, and he could see this as perhaps being a painting of the actual palace at Knossos, with people in the courtyard looking up towards the throne room there. This reconstruction drawing of the main part gives you perhaps a better impression of what he was actually seeing in that particular fresco. But the most remarkable of all the paintings at Knossos were scenes of the people of Knossos. They show generally a mixture of scenes. So you've got people walking through gardens with flowers, you've got people walking in processions, you've got people dancing, as we'll see in the next one. A characteristic feature of all the paintings is that the men are always shown with a brown skin, women are always shown with a white skin. We have this saying in English, to be blue-blooded. It means you're connected to royalty. Well, the origin of that saying is quite simply this, that a queen or a wife of a nobleman would never go out in the sunshine. So her skin would always be white, which meant that you could always see the blue veins. Right? I know it's red stuff inside there, but it looks blue when you look at it. And we can see the same type of thing in the sense at Knossos. Obviously, the women did not go out in the sunshine. So you've got scenes like this and scenes here of dancing women in a kind of orchestra ceremony as well. The remarkable feature about all these paintings is that all of them, without exception, show young people. There are no paintings of babies or children or of old people, giving Evans the impression of a very youthful, vital society. The clothing is very distinctive. As we look, as we see here, for example, men are always shown bare-chested and with a kind of kilt, a wraparound dress there with elaborate hairstyles like that. Women are more often than not shown bare-breasted with elaborate jewellery. Their dresses tend to be rather on the high side, tied up with a tight belt like that. How they breathe, nobody knows. And it was also quite clear from the wall painting that this bare-chested attitude of the women was a common feature of the society there, but also the use of cosmetics, so with nipples painted red, and in the one that Evans particularly liked, he called her the Parisienne, the woman from Paris. You can see her bright red lipstick in that particular case. There was also other paintings which he spotted there. Some of these paintings were really pretty remarkable in the sense that you had paintings of bull leaping ceremonies. And he began to wonder if there was actually possibly some truth in the story of the Minotaur. Well, Evans kept on excavating at the site from 1900 to 1921. Already by 1902, he had a reputation like Schliemann, the discoverer of something nobody had previously suspected. He was lecturing throughout Europe, invited to dinner parties and things like that, all the time getting more money to pay for the continuance of the excavations at Knossos. He finished the excavations in 1921, having decided to reconstruct parts of the site. And this reconstruction process continued until 1935. Well, this was a controversial decision then, and it still is now. Many archaeologists believe that you should never reconstruct a site because we can never be 100% certain we know what the original building looked like. In some cases, for example at Ephesus, where you have the collapsed front of a library building, you can put it back together. But at Knossos, there was not much standing above 1 or 2 meters high. So what Evans had to do was basically use the painting of the palace building and what archaeological evidence he had to reconstruct something that would at least give the appearance of what Knossos was like. He wanted the site to come alive. He wanted visitors to realize what the site perhaps looked like. Well, in many ways, his reconstruction is now accepted as being reasonably accurate. The only problem is that he used concrete for the first time concrete had ever been used on the island of Crete. He used steel reinforced concrete, the first time that had been used on Crete, and of course steel, rust, and so the concrete starts breaking up. So there is a bit of a problem with them. But nonetheless, you can go to the site of Knossos now, you can see this reconstruction of the whole series of rooms going down on the east side of the site, the so-called palace rooms. A bit of imagination as to what the windows and doors would have looked like and the positions of the windows. This is the reconstruction of the throne room on the top there. And you can see remnants of the great staircase going up to that. The throne room proper is on that level. Reconstruction of part of one of the palace state rooms with concrete reproductions of the original wooden columns there. The columns, as you'll see, have got a rather strange shape. Normally when you think of a column, you think of something that goes like that, the widest part at the base. But what Evans realised was that the builders of the palace here knew enough about building technology so that when they used large pieces of wood, a tree trunk from a large tree, they realised that if they just cut the tree down and put the base of the tree on the ground, the tree would start growing roots again. So they put them upside down. So the tree couldn't start growing roots again. Very clever idea. The reconstructions, as I've said, you can see they're beginning to fall away in some places here. But they have certainly achieved what Evans desired, which was to convince people when they arrived there that this was what the site may have looked like. Not how it looked like, but may have looked like. And here you can see, for example, how he's used concrete instead of what would have been wood for the door frames. And these concrete beams in a real building, they would have been wooden beams. Crete suffers from earthquakes, so it allows the rooms to, the walls to shake. And certainly, if you go to Knossos, you see people thoroughly enjoying going around this real site. But Arthur Evans was fully aware of the need to properly publish his discoveries at Knossos. So each winter from 1901 to 1935, he and his assistants basically reread the excavation records. They sorted through thousands of pieces of pottery, metal and stone objects and things like that. He wanted to build up a picture, a real picture of what Knossos was like in the past. Unlike Schliemann, who was always happy to say, this is Knossos, the palace of King Minos, the origin of the story of the Minotaur, Evans was just a little bit careful about doing that. But the problem was, as time went by, he began to realize how things connected. You had the grand staircase going down into the ground, rooms on 4 different levels cut into the hillside, dark winding passages, some of the columns decorated with a labyrinth axe. This could be the origin of the name labyrinth. Labyrinth basically means a place of the labyrinth axes. Taken into account also that the labyrinth over here was the location for a remarkable series of paintings and other particular finds. One of these paintings shows this. We don't know what the significance of this is. We can interpret it in what's going on. We can see that it's a bull running or charging. Its horns are being held by a person who is white. The figures are not complete, but as they are white, they must represent women. Leaping over the back of the bull is a brown figure, so clearly a man. And Evans found that this type of design also turned up on pottery and even on rings as well. He could see the connections developing. And when you take into account that the whole site of Knossos is carved with these it has these stone statues, as it were, around them, which he could see represent bull's horns, and they're also shown on the palace fresco. He could begin to build up a story of what might have happened. The bull cult played an important part in the everyday life, or the life, shall we say, of the people of Knossos. We have the bull leaping ceremony on paintings and on rings. We have these representations of bull's horns all around the site. We have a series of rooms underground, approached by a staircase, passages, the rooms decorated with representations of this axe, the labyrinth. This could be the origin of the story of the labyrinth. Perhaps the story of the Minotaur is a very uncertain memory of what actually happened at Knossos. We still don't know. Perhaps a King Minos really did have a very large bull, and perhaps there were sacrifices to that bull. How that bull became transformed into half bull, half man could have developed from the bull leaping ceremony. You can see somebody gets this idea, oh, you know, the story starts, so somebody jumps over a bull, bit by bit, it's a half man, half bull, that type of thing. And then Evan started to think about the rest of the story of King Minos. How Theseus had returned to the island and destroyed the palace. He had two main periods of occupation. The first one destroyed in a major fire. The second one associated with Mycenaean pottery, representing possibly an invasion of the island by people using Mycenaean pottery. This could be the origin of the character of Theseus as well. Well, whatever the truth in the legend, Evans was pretty clear in his mind that he had found a site that people in the past had believed to be the palace of King Minos. And so when he started to publish his results in 1921, these were published in a series of volumes with the title, The Palace of Minos. In these volumes, he built up a picture of an ancient society, which he called the Minoans. All the evidence indicated that the Minoan people had extensive trade links throughout the whole of the Mediterranean. Possibly as early as the 19th century, certainly to the 14th century. It's possible, to judge from the spread of pottery, that Minoans had settled in other parts of the Mediterranean. It's possible that some of the palace-type buildings to be seen in Crete and in Greece might actually be the palaces of Minoan traders or rulers. The evidence from the site was quite clear that the Minoans were self-supporting people, growing their own wheat and barley, enormous storerooms at the palace site of Knossos itself. Evidence from animal bones of cattle, sheep and goats. But olives and probably grapes seem to have been the main source of wealth for the people of Knossos at any rate. 395,000 litres of olive oil stored on the site. Mycenaean pottery found all over the Mediterranean, pottery of a type that could be used for exporting olive oil. The grape and the olive grow in exactly the same climatic conditions. So it's quite likely that it wasn't just olive oil, it was the grape for making wine as well. Whatever it was, the people of Knossos, the people of Crete at this time, were evidently wealthy enough and had enough trade contacts to become very rich. To make bronze, you need tin and copper. In the Bronze Age, the only place where you could find tin was in Britain or Spain, some parts of Italy as well. The people of Knossos were trading with people from Spain and Britain to get tin. Copper almost certainly came from Cyprus. The name Cyprus today, well, originally it meant something very different. Kupros is the Latin name, Greek name for copper. Cyprus is the copper island. But when you look at the other materials which you find at Knossos, there's gold and silver. Gold probably from Egypt, silver probably from Western Turkey. There was ivory objects and ostrich eggs, Egypt and Africa. Lapis lazuli again from Afghanistan. Well, everything pointed to the Minoan people, as Schliemann had suspected, as controlling the trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. We don't accept that now, but that's what it pointed to at that point. Well, the last volume of the Palace of Minos appeared in 1935. Evans was then 84 or so. And as he said in his conclusion to that volume, and as he continued to say until he died in 1941 at the age of 90, he had discovered another Bronze Age civilization that was earlier than Mycenae, earlier than the Trojan Wars. But he regretted one thing. He had gone to Crete to try and decipher the three different types of writing. Pictograph writing, Linear A, and Linear B. And he died without succeeding in translating or deciphering any of these. And in fact, it wasn't until 1951 that this man here, Michael Ventris, managed to come up with a decipherment of Linear B. He's another one of these people who found learning languages so easy it makes me really annoyed. You know, I'm still struggling with Turkish after 17 years. You know, but he just gets languages like Schliemann. I'm going to sit down with Tintin in Turkish and English, I think, and probably learn it that way. Might work better. Well, this is a Linear B tablet. What Michael Ventris decided to do, he heard Evans talk about this language and these language scripts in Oxford in about 1938 or so. After the Second World War, when he was in military service, he was a trained architect who used his spare time to make a catalogue, no computers, of all the symbols used on Linear B tablets, Linear A, pictographs, where they were found in combination. What he eventually realized was that Linear B consists of logograms, and it's a syllabary. A logogram stands for a whole word, and it represents items. A man, woman, pretty obvious what they are really in many ways, isn't it? So it was possible to work these ones out and come up with meanings for them. The other part of Linear B, though, is a syllabary. This syllabary is a set of symbols which represent or approximate to syllables which make up words in them. So he was eventually able to come up with possible soundings for these. Don't ask me how he did it. I'm not an expert at languages, you all know that, but he did. And what he came up with in 1951 was what Linear B was. Linear B is the earliest form of Greek that we have, written before Greek started using an alphabet. Well, Linear B tablets, of course, are found all over Greece. Some are found on Knossos. So clearly indications of Greek settlement of the island of Knossos there. And of course you can recognize some of these words even today. I mean, kumino, kumunion, kumin in kimyon in Turkish. I mean, the words haven't changed that much, have they? Pater, 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 father. Linear B being Greek, Indo-European language, so fairly straightforward in that way. Now I leave you with a challenge. Nobody has deciphered the pictographs or Linear A yet. So, anybody want a lifetime's work? There we are, we finished on that one. How did I do for time today, Emre? Oh, bang on time, right. The ground. Aegeus, the king of Athens at this time, pleads for peace, and what Minos says is you can have peace on one condition, and that is that every 9 years, starting from that year, the Athenians would have to send to him 7 youths and 7 young girls to Crete, where there would be a human sacrifice for the Minotaur. So it was that for every 9 years, for a while afterwards, 14 young Athenians were sent to Minos. But the third time this was due to happen, the people of Athens said to Aegeus, "You've got to do something about this." Well, Aegeus' son was called Theseus, and he was a great hero of this particular period. He did lots of wonderful things throughout the world. He just got back to Athens and he volunteered to solve the problem by killing the Minotaur. And so he sailed with the next group of Athenians to Crete. When they arrived at Crete, they were placed in a locked room. Well, good afternoon everyone. The last class of this week. I still have to do a makeup. I don't know when I'm going to do it, probably next week sometime. This class is about Sir Arthur Evans at the palace site of Knossos on the island of Crete, the realm of the Minotaur. Well, as we saw in the last class, Schliemann, working at Mycenae and at Tiryns, had found a particularly distinctive type of pottery there, at both sites. We call it late Helladic ware now, he called it Mycenaean ware. The distinctive feature being these spiral decorations, painted decorations on these vases, as we see there and there. So a very distinctive pottery. And when Schliemann began to do more, and while they were standing in a locked room, Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, saw Theseus and fell hopelessly in love with him. She determined to rescue him. So when the time actually came for the sacrifice, Theseus chose to be the first person who would go to the Minotaur, and Ariadne managed to give him secretly a sword with which he could kill the Minotaur and hopefully come out and take her away and marry her and live happily ever after. But she knew that a labyrinth, underground, very dark, lots of twisting corridors and passages, it would be very difficult for Theseus to find his way out. So she gave him a ball of wool. She held one end of this. He walked into the labyrinth with the other end of the ball of wool, found the Minotaur, killed the Minotaur, and came back along with research on this type of pottery. He found out that it was discovered all over Greece. It had also been found on the west coast of Turkey, in the Aegean Islands, on Crete, North Africa, Cyrene, in Egypt, and in Syria as well. What this did was to convince Schliemann, bearing in mind what he'd found at Mycenae and Tiryns, evidence of societies that had large trade contacts, he then became convinced that he had the evidence for a Bronze Age civilization that had in effect controlled the whole of the Mediterranean world. And the most logical place for this to be centered on was Crete, in the center of the distribution of the pottery. Schliemann, remember, had a very good knowledge of ancient Greek tradition and myth and legend, and he was well aware of the legend related to the island of Crete, the legend of King Minos. The legend says that King Minos, a ruler who lived somewhere in Crete at a palace called Knossos, had underneath the palace a series of underground chambers known as the labyrinth. Labyrinth because they twisted from one area to another. And in the labyrinth, according to the legend, King Minos kept the Minotaur. Taurus bull, so this is Minos's bull. But this creature was half human and half bull. Now, according to the legend, King Minos sent his son Androgenes to Athens to take part in the religious games there. But he was so successful that the king of Athens decided to kill him to stop him from winning any more of the competitions. So what Minos does is he responds to this by invading Athens, he captures the city, he burns the city to